Hello and welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I am Bob Arnold, President here at Disaster Coverage Journal. Today's sponsor is Alert Media, and the topic is Ask the Meteorologist, preparing your organization for the 2022 hurricane season. To help welcome and introduce our panelists today, I'd like to now turn it over to Katie Goen.
Hi, thanks, Bob. I am Katie Goen, Senior Marketing Manager at Alert Media, and I'll be your moderator today. I know you are all very eager to hear about this year's hurricane forecast and any potential impacts to your people and business. So I don't want to take up too much time here at the top, but I do want to mention that today's webinar is interactive. So you can feel free to ask questions or make a comment at any time throughout the presentation. You don't have to wait until the end, as Bob said. And for those of you who submitted a question when you registered, thank you so much for doing that. It is always super helpful. We did incorporate those questions into today's content. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. First, we have Jason Moreland, Senior Meteorologist at Alert Media. Jason graduated from the University of South Alabama with a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology with a focus on industrial meteorology. And his professional experience within the private sector includes more than a decade of extensive domestic, international, and even offshore forecasting. And throughout his career, Jason has provided really critical decision-making support to a wide range of businesses, live event venues, and even sensitive utility and offshore projects ahead of impending hazardous weather. So hello, Jason. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the warm introduction, Katie, and I'm just glad to be a part of what's going to be a very important topic going into another, what appears to be active hurricane season.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for being here, Jason. And we also have Sarah Prattley with us today. Sarah is the Vice President of Global Intelligence at Alert Media, and she leads a team of experienced analysts to monitor emerging threats and incidents nationwide. Actually worldwide, not nationwide. And prior to Alert Media, she was at CNN, where she was the Vice President of National News for their domestic news gathering unit. So she led the network's coverage on some pretty major events like the Boston Marathon bombing, the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, numerous severe natural disasters, and many, many more. And during her decade there at CNN, she developed this unique ability to assess, analyze, and decipher information quickly. And so lucky for us, she now applies that skill set to her role at Alert Media. So welcome, Sarah. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Katie. Appreciate it. And Bob, thanks for having us. We're super excited to jump into the topic today.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of that, I do want to just quickly review today's agenda so we all know what to expect over the next 45 minutes to an hour. So first, we are going to break down the official 2022 hurricane forecast. Then we're going to talk about some potential business impacts that hurricanes and tropical storms can bring. We're going to give you some tips on how to prepare and protect your people and your property. And then finally, we're going to make sure you have some great recommended resources so that you can stay up to date on hurricane activity throughout the season. So before we do dive into any of that, I do want to take a moment just to launch a poll. It's really important that we know what your primary concerns are for this year's hurricane season. So if you'll just take a minute to answer the question on your screen, which is, what are your company's primary concerns for the 2022 hurricane season? And you can select as many as you like. It doesn't have to be just one. It could be property facility damage, protecting your on-site employees, protecting your dispersed or your remote employees, communication before, during, and after a storm. That's always a big one. Or maybe it's the business continuity post-storm. So go ahead and get your answers in now. And then Bob, I'll ask you to go ahead and close that poll out and share the results with us if you don't mind. All right, so 79% are concerned about communication, which I don't think is really any surprise there, but it's important to note that all of these options are represented rather strongly here in the results. So let me ask you, Jason, is that surprising to you at all or about what you expected?
Not too surprising, and I would say that it's a positive indication that everyone is considering all of the big factors here, because each and every one of these points should at least be part of your overall hurricane preparedness plan.
Absolutely. And Sarah, anything to add to that?
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think everything is really strong for all the right reasons. So hopefully we can help prepare everybody today.
Absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to pass it over to Jason now, who's going to provide just a quick review of the 2021 hurricane season, and then he's going to break down the forecast for this year. So Jason, over to you.
Thank you so much. So as Katie mentioned, I felt like it would be best to maybe review some of the things that we've been through over the past year, because we've seen quite a number of storms, not just in 2021, but it's really been a record-setting prior to hurricane seasons. When you think about it, not just the 21 named storms of 2021, but in total over the last 2 years, we've seen over 50 named storms within the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Gulf of Mexico. And prior to these past 2 seasons, that would have been something that many meteorologists would have considered as something unheard of. And so we are a bit in a way of entering into new territory here with the amount of activity seen in recent years. And in addition to those 21 named storms, we've had a total of 7 hurricanes that developed. 4 of those strengthened further into major hurricanes. And whenever we say major hurricane, that's really your category 3 and higher storm. And it's really Ida that was the most well-known out of those 4. There were 2 other major hurricanes, Larry and Sam, that stayed well to the east of the United States. We got lucky in those situations. And then farther south, we also had to deal with Hurricane Grace that made a long track across the Caribbean Sea. It then rapidly intensified after crossing the Yucatan Peninsula. It rapidly intensified into a major hurricane in the Bay of Campeche and southwest Gulf of Mexico before causing extensive flooding and damage within southern Mexico. So we definitely had our hands full here on the forecast side of things. And in addition to that, there were 4 separate billion-dollar disasters across the country as it pertains to tropical weather. Of course, one of those was Hurricane Ida, but there's other storms that we could easily forget just because of how active it's been. So one other notable storm that comes to mind was Hurricane Elsa, which really weakened down to a tropical storm before making that final direct landfall across the southeast US. But despite weakening and only being a quote unquote tropical storm, it was still a $1 billion disaster when all was said and done. Some of the most extensive flooding occurred as the system recurved all the way through the mid-Atlantic and northeast US, saw flooding in New York City. And then another storm that comes to mind, yet again, another $1 billion tropical storm, that was Tropical Storm Fred. That system also made landfall across the state of Florida, but really it did most of its damage once it got into the Appalachian Mountains out across western North Carolina. We saw significant inland flooding. There were widespread deaths across western North Carolina as a result of that inland flooding. So that's also one of the big topics I'm going to address today, is not getting carried away by just looking at major hurricanes. It's also these weaker, supposedly named storms that we also have to factor. And then finally, there was also Nicholas, a low-end Category 1 hurricane that struck Texas. And some of the worst impacts were not directly near the landfalling center. It was actually a little bit farther toward the east across Louisiana. So we're going to dive more into some of these storms, and specifically more than all of them, Ida, just because it was the prime example of some of the things to be on the lookout for during these landfalling hurricane situations.
Jason, is it true that in 2021, all of the names were used? Like all of the potential names for storms?
Yes, that's the incredible thing about it. This was only the 3rd season on record that we've exhausted the entire original set of names. The prior years before that were 2005 and also the year 2020. So we had back-to-back seasons that exhausted the original set of names. And for those that may have been on the call last year, just as a reminder, we did go ahead and implement, there is now a backup list in place. So if that happens again and we have to go into what was initially the Greek alphabet, we now have a supplemental list to make it a little bit less confusing.
All right, well, let's see what we got for this year.
So this is one of the first forecasts that come out. It's from Colorado State University. And the reason why CSU is often brought up when it comes to these seasonal hurricane forecasts, the researchers at CSU are the pioneers in seasonal hurricane forecasting. This is something that dates well back into the 1980s and even a little bit before that. And they've expressed a pretty high degree of accuracy, especially in some of the more recent seasons. And so we place a lot of weight on the latest CSU forecast. And also, before we get into those 2022 numbers, you can see on the left-hand side what the forecast looked like before the 2020 and 2021 seasons. And, I think as meteorologists, sometimes we get a bad rap because it always seems like we're forecasting a busy hurricane season lately. But when you compare the forecast numbers to what has actually happened in the last 2 years, you can see, if anything, we're underestimating these seasons. We're in an upward swing here across the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Gulf, and some of these numbers are definitely surpassing those early season projections. And we can see what we're now looking at for 2022. The forecast calls for 19 named storms, 8 of which are likely to become hurricanes, and 4 of those very well could become major hurricanes. And just for comparison purposes, on average, there's usually about 13 to 14 named storms, 7 becoming hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. And this is also with accounting for the latest 30-year average, which accounts for some of these busier seasons that we've already gone through. And yet this coming season is still supposed to be more active than that more recent average. And just to extend over to the next slide, you can see that the forecast for an above average season is starting to gain traction from other weather services. So this is the North Carolina State forecast, and they provide a bit of a different forecast. It does contain a range, but as you can see on the right-hand side, they're going with 17 to 21 named storms, 7 to 9 hurricanes, and 3 to 5 major hurricanes. So this is very comparable to that more recent forecast that we just looked at from CSU. And just as a bit of a spoiler alert, we don't yet have access to the official forecast from NOAA. That's going to be released this coming week. But based on everything that I'm looking at, I wouldn't be surprised if their forecast numbers are at least as high, just based on the most recent indications we're seeing around the Atlantic and also the Pacific. So I felt like it would still be worthwhile to kind of dive into what are some of the factors that are causing these record levels of numbers here. It's one thing just to spit a bunch of numbers out there, but I would like to provide some sort of context just to give the idea that we're just not throwing random numbers and there's not much information that we're processing, because there is quite a lot of data that's going into these forecasts. So first and foremost, the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Gulf, we're currently within a long-term high activity era. And so dating back to 1995, you can chart that this has been a major upswing in activity. The 1970s and 1980s were much quieter than this pattern that we're currently within. And this is a well-known long-term cycle that usually ranges between 20 to 40 years. And so there's a very good chance that we could see this continue for yet another possibly 10 to 20 years. So that's one main thing, and it involves water temperatures being well above normal across that Atlantic Basin region. And another thing that is a very significant factor that goes into the forecast is what's happening out there on the Pacific side. And we're talking about, is there a El Nino in place? Or what about El Nino, which is the complete opposite? And basically, it's just the variation in water temperatures out across the Pacific compared to normal. And we are now entering what is a 3rd year of La Nina conditions. And this is a bad omen for the upcoming Atlantic hurricane season, because La Nina supports below average wind shear. And we're also looking at greater instability for storms on the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Gulf side. Overall, the wind shear is low. We see lower surface pressures. That's just another driver for more storm activity. And so that's a big thing that we're looking at. Another thing that we're looking at is, like I said, the below average wind shear that is present across the Atlantic. The forecast models, the long range guidance shows that this pattern is going to continue well into the summer months. And then finally, we even look as far east as the western regions of Africa, because when you think about it, a lot of tropical activity, it starts off as just a tropical wave or a tropical disturbance that comes off the West African coastline. And over the years, there's been a lot of research. Once it's a wetter than normal monsoon season out there, that's often a precursor to more Atlantic driven hurricane activity. And actually, we here at Alert Media, we follow everything. So there was even some flooding within the capital city of Ghana just a few days ago. So this wet monsoon period in Western Africa is continuing to verify.
And Jason, we got many questions about whether or not you know where these hurricanes could potentially hit. Some folks wanted to specifically know about, I think it was Florida, we had the Northeast, we had California, we even had the Costa Rica. So is there any way to give guidance to those folks on what they can expect or not?
So unfortunately, the science isn't quite there yet. So if you start to hear predictions about particular states or cities being hit more than 1 or 2 weeks in advance, I would say to just take those forecasts with a grain of salt. Now, the one thing that I will say is that there is at least a weak correlation between net tropical cyclone activity, or the amount of storms that are out there, which makes a lot of sense, because if you have a lot of storms, the greater the probability that at least a few make it all the way across the Atlantic. and you end up with more landfalls. So Colorado State, for example, they are predicting above average probabilities of a major hurricane landfall across the Caribbean Sea and also the US coast, including the Gulf Coast and the US Eastern Seaboard.
Gotcha. All right, well, I will move on to the current picture now.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, you're probably asking, why are we looking at the current picture? Doesn't the official season start on June 1st? And I'm right there with you. But the one ridiculous thing about this active cycle that we've been in is that there's been 7 years in a row in which we've had the first named storm of the season before the season even starts. And so we're actively looking to see if there's any potential for early season activity. And for anyone that's living along the southeast US coastline and you're active on social media, over the past week, you may have seen a lot of scary posts about the potential for an early season storm somewhere across the Gulf of Mexico. And again, always watch what sort of sources that you're using for weather information, because although we are seeing a lot of those same things, sometimes those other outlets can get a little carried away. And there was one particular model that showed development over the next 5 to 7 days and has since backed off its forecast. So no immediate concerns out there to be worried about, although that could also just as easily change as we head into those first 10 to 15 days of June. So just as a reminder, we do have some upcoming important dates to consider. And actually, just to backtrack a little bit, May 15th was the official start of hurricane season on the eastern Pacific side of Mexico. And it is somewhat common for them to get early season development there. Right now, there's no active disturbances in the eastern Pacific. Coming up next week on May 24th, we will be getting the official forecast release from NOAA. Like I said, not to be a spoiler here, but likely going to be some very high numbers coming with that forecast. And some important things, maybe not so much for businesses, but more so your employees, is to take advantage of some of these hurricane preparedness tax holidays that are going to be coming out. So near the end of May, we have one of those in Virginia, and we also have tax holiday breaks across the states of Florida and Louisiana. And it's really good to use those dates that are listed to go out and buy some of those last minute hurricane supplies like generators, flashlights, that sort of deal, especially in this day and age with inflation. We need all the tax relief that we can get with some of these hurricane preparedness items. So those would be some great times to go ahead and add to your list. So finally, hurricane season begins June 1st, and then it's really not until we get into mid-September. It's usually around September 10th and 11th on average that we see the climatological peak of hurricane season. And then finally, as we get into late November, November 30th, that's the official end of hurricane season, and we can be done with this 2022 active year.
Yeah, and Jason, I know we're going to touch on communication later, but I think for those sales tax holidays you mentioned, it would be amazing if organizations communicated those dates to their employees so that they could, better prepare their homes, right? And I think, the more communication that organizations put out about that type of thing, the better prepared their people will be. Would you agree?
Absolutely, 100%. Definitely get the message out, because you might be surprised. It actually took a little bit of research and homework just to find these dates. So definitely spread the word there.
Excellent.
Another thing I wanted to just quickly touch on is this long-term trend, because I know that with a lot of talk about climate change, there's been a lot of questions. Is the weather really getting worse? Are we seeing this when it comes to tropical activity, the degree of intensity of these landfalls? And so one thing that you can see looking back at prior decades, it's a very notable upswing in activity that especially began around the mid-1990s, and we have seen a subtle to, I would argue, steady increase in named storm counts over the past 30 years. Now, one of the reasons why we are seeing this big upswing is because the technology to monitor these storms has gotten so much better. There's better forecast model data, there's more high resolution radar, satellite, a lot of factors that are making us much better at detecting these storms. So we are seeing more in the way of these weaker named storms being tracked, whereas they may have been missed in the past. But that doesn't exactly tell the entire picture either. Some other important things to keep in mind is we are seeing slower moving storms after they move inland. We're seeing more in the way of heavy rainfall events. And we've also seen a big upswing in the rapid intensification cycle of hurricanes right before they're making landfall. And that's one of the big fears that we have as forecasters. And then the other takeaway by looking at this chart is that even though we are in an active cycle, there can be a lot of year-over-year variability. Even ever since the late 90s, there are the occasional seasons in which it can be below average. And again, just to kind of go back to the activity timeline, at this point last year, we were actually discussing, there was chatter within the weather world about, are we going to bump up the official start date of the hurricane season to May 15th? And it's because, like I said, we've had now 7 seasons in a row in which we had an early season storm. Ultimately, the decision was to keep it for June 1st, because when you really think about it, when it comes to the more powerhouse storms and especially the hurricanes, over 97% of those storms occur between June and November. So just from a communication and messaging standpoint to the general public, we're keeping those dates for the time being. And again, on average, the first named storm of the year is around June 20th. Third named storm is around August 3rd. So we really don't become super active typically until we get into more so late August, early September. The one caveat though is every season is different. The weather doesn't pay attention to a calendar. And by July 1st of last year, we were already up to 5 named storms. So things can change really quickly out there in the tropics. I like to throw up this graphic every single year. How has hurricane forecasting improved or changed over the years? And I think the general public would be surprised as to how much better the Hurricane Center has gotten at forecasting these storms. If we look back even as recent as 2005, this was Hurricane Rita on the left. At the point of this track, it was only a depression out there east of the Bahamas, but you can see the 3 to 5 day forecast track took up basically the entire Gulf of Mexico. Whereas we had a similar magnitude storm brewing out across the Caribbean in 2021, and you can see that was virtually cut in half, this overall forecast cone. And another important thing to learn about these cones is that the size of these are not really dependent on individual storms. It has more to do with the 5-year error or the normal errors that the Hurricane Center has made in the previous 5 seasons. And so you can see with little by little advancements every year that this cone has become consolidated. One other quick thing to note though is that the smaller this cone gets over the years, the bigger of a forecast communication challenge this is becoming, because the hurricane and tropical storm impacts can extend well from this cone. So even though we're getting pretty good at determining exactly where the storm is going to be, impacts are a totally different ballgame. This is only involving where the track is going to be. So that's going to be one of the big no-nos when it comes to hurricane preparedness, just focusing on that center line. And also one other thing, despite the fact that we've gotten a lot better, out of every 3 instances, the storm can move outside of this cone on average 1 time, so 1 out of 3. So just some other caveats to consider when looking at these forecasts.
Jason, we got a question about this. With all these technological advancements, do you think there's ever going to be a way where we'll know exactly where landfall will take place sooner than, a day or so out?
Yeah, so I do envision that we're going to continue to see slow but steady improvements year over year. In fact, I would say there's a pretty high chance within the next 2 to 3 seasons that you're going to see these 5-day forecasts become 7-day forecasts from the Hurricane Center. So we're going to have in upwards of 7-day forecast tracks. Now, in terms of, are we going to know for sure what county or city a week in advance? I think we're still a long way away from seeing something to that magnitude, but continuous improvements, yes, we can anticipate that.
Excellent.
So one of the main topics in today's presentation is going to include the fact that these storm impacts can extend well inland. And this never gets enough attention, even though it's been more of a topic in recent years. This point needs to be driven home more and more. And we'll start this off by looking at a summary of maximum rainfall that has been observed with prior tropical storms dating all the way back to the year 1900. And you can see just the vast extent of the country that has been involved with these inland rainfall events. And so one question that might come to mind as soon as you look at this is, I'm seeing places like California and Arizona included within this. And the one thing I will say about the Southwest US is that usually those impacts are more related to the Pacific hurricane season, and only about a handful of storms on record have made it all the way into the Southwest US as a still classified named storm. But we can still get the remnant rainfall that comes through across the Baja Peninsula, Northwest Mexico, and we do occasionally need to be concerned about flash flood events that far west. But going back to the central and eastern US, even the Midwest United States dealing with multiple widespread 7 to 10 plus inch rainfall events from these recurving systems once they cross the southeast. So we're going to talk a lot about Ida here over the next few minutes. As we all are probably familiar, this was the big blockbuster storm of 2021 for the United States, but it was a blockbuster in many ways. First and foremost, it went from a tropical depression about 3.5 days before landfall to a high-end Category 4 hurricane with 150-mile-an-hour winds. Sometimes you won't get that 5 to 7 day track guidance before landfall, so do be mindful of that. Second, there was 20 feet of storm surge. Those impacts are very obvious. I think everyone kind of is aware of the storm surge threats by now. Get away from the coast during these major hurricane situations. But on this particular graphic, the main concern is the heavy rainfall. And no surprise, 10 to 15 inches around coastal Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. But look at the second maximum across the Northeast United States. Some people may be surprised by this, but more people died from inland freshwater rainfall flooding in the Northeast than the Southeast from Hurricane Ida, a major hurricane. This was also the first time that many areas in the Northeast US were placed under a flash flood emergency, which is one level even higher than a flash flood warning. Many people were caught off guard, even though the forecasts were in place several days before the remnants of the storm made its way into that area. And we saw catastrophic impacts across northern New Jersey, New York City, the list goes on. So that's definitely something to be mindful of. Even as these storms are weakening, definitely don't let your guard off there, because these storms are going to continue into the Tennessee Valley and so on. Same applies for the tornado situation. So a lot of times we may not necessarily think about tornado outbreaks when it comes to a landfalling tropical storm or hurricane. As you can see though, with Ida, 35 confirmed tornadoes. A good majority of those tornadoes were along the Gulf Coast, but as it turned into the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, it combined with a cold front. There was a lot of other weather factors in place, like wind shear and things of that nature. There was a pretty high-end tornado that caused widespread damage in parts of New Jersey. So don't write off the tornado threat, even though it's just a small part of the puzzle. Definitely something to consider when it comes to these landfalling systems. And then, of course, there's the more common thing, the power outages. No surprise across Louisiana. At one point, there were over 1 million people without power across the state. And the one tidbit I would say about Louisiana is that even though the very worst of the most maximum winds were just south and west of New Orleans, just about all of the metro was pitch black for a good half week. And it's, sometimes things that you don't even consider. It was a large transmission line that was draped across the Mississippi River that crews had to address before they could even start to restore power across the New Orleans metro. And then, as we can see, as this storm kind of re-intensified through some subtropical processes, we saw widespread winds and heavy rainfall that caused additional outages throughout the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast US.
Jason, we got a few questions about typhoons and tsunamis. Can hurricanes cause those or impact those in any way?
Yeah, so this is just the only issue with too much weather jargon, too many different names for the same types of systems, and I don't blame anyone for the confusion. So a typhoon is basically the same thing as a hurricane, but it's on the Western Pacific side of the world. So that's just what they call the tropical storms and hurricanes out that way. And when it comes to tsunamis, it's a different process altogether, but I can understand where the confusion comes through, because hurricanes are well known for the storm surge, and it's not necessarily one big wave that just rushes into inland communities. Although I will say, if you ever have a levee breach, all of a sudden that water can rush in. And that's what we saw in the lower Ninth Ward during Hurricane Katrina. They went from dry conditions, everything was okay at least, and then within 15 minutes, the water rushed in and they had 6 to 10 feet of water in their homes. But technically, that's different from a tsunami.
Got it, thank you.
So just some key takeaways: the forecasting and the technology continues to improve. The one thing that I will say about preparation is that although the tracks continue to improve, we are still lagging a bit when it comes to forecasting the intensity of these storms. And as just a general practice, if they're forecasting a Cat 2 at landfall, brace for one category higher just in case it defies those expectations. Category 3 would certainly be on the table. And as I've said, especially over the past 5 years, we've seen multiple rapidly intensifying hurricanes within those final 24 hours. It's not uncommon to go to sleep, a storm is a tropical storm, and then by the next day it's a major hurricane. Something very important to consider there. And this kind of goes back to point number 3. They are getting stronger to some degree. We're definitely seeing a greater frequency of named storms, and we're seeing longer lasting impacts as these storms are extending inland with these slower moving storms and more significant heavy rainfall events. And we're seeing steadily more increasing billion-dollar storm events, not just with tropical storms, but even typical flash flood events from other types of weather phenomena, and that these impacts are impacting people and businesses far removed from the Gulf Coast and Southeast U.S. coastline.
Wonderful. Well, I
So,
think next, yeah.
Sorry about that. I was just gonna spread some of the information out across the team here, and I think to tackle some of the potential business impacts, I'd like to have Sarah go ahead and discuss some of those potential impacts with everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds good. All right. Well, unfortunately, there are numerous potential business impacts when we're talking about the hurricane season, especially as Jason indicated, we're looking again at another active one. And one of the big impacts I think we're all very attuned to right now is remote workers. So earlier this year, Alert Media actually conducted a study of more than 2,000 US-based employees to understand perceptions of safety in the workplace. And our research found that 82% of employees feel that their employer has some sort of responsibility when it comes to keeping remote workers safe. And this level of trust in businesses and in leaders like yourselves is amazing, right? But it does come with a lot of responsibility on each of us to keep our employees and our workforce safe during times of big impacts like things like hurricanes. So since much of the US workforce is now working remote or hybrid, often in locations that aren't necessarily near corporate offices or headquarters or facilities, that data really brings into focus why it's so important for us to protect our employees who may not be able to effectively get communication and things like that, and really amp those things up for them. So even though your locations may not be in hurricane-prone areas, your employees themselves could be, and they're going to look for you or to you for guidance if and when they're going to be impacted by a storm. So as Jason discussed, hurricane season can affect all areas of the country, not just the coastal locations. He had a lot of really great visuals, particularly from Ida last year, and all the impacts that we obviously saw inland, not even just in the southeast, but up into the northeast. And with that, you think about things like oil and gas and other fuels. Those can obviously be in short supply after a hurricane, which of course limits transportation and can cause supply chain disruptions. Hurricanes can also damage oil rigs. Obviously, that's not something that's in line of sight, but something that can truly disrupt supply and further the limits that we're seeing. And I think we're all really attuned to this right now. It's going to be incredibly interesting to see how fuel costs are going to be impacted this year, given the huge increases that we're all currently experiencing and have experienced in recent months. And then supply chain, of course, has been beaten and battered and bruised by the pandemic. Any major ports that were necessarily hit by a hurricane would obviously present a lot more impacts this year than in previous years. There's also the conflict in Ukraine. I know we talk about that a lot in other circumstances, but it's also important here. There's already impacts that we see to fuel shortages, to supply chain, into food supply. And obviously any area that's impacted by a hurricane is just going to feel this even more. A lack of electricity, it can cause a lot of problems. I think some of them that are more at the forefront for us are, people being able to turn on lights in homes and offices and being able to work. But one note we always like to make is that in these situations, generally retailers are also forced into a cash only scenario, but ATMs going down, it's really important for us as employers and for consumers to be able to transition into some sort of cash only environment if the opportunity arises there. This is a big one. Obviously, many industries with facilities that are likely to be impacted are going to experience some sort of downtime and lost revenue. Obviously, that's big to the bottom line for all of our businesses. And then also important, once a natural disaster occurs, there's always the question of recovery, right? Both how much time it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. FEMA is a really important part of that conversation. We actually had somebody on our Alert Media podcast recently who gave kind of a general rule of thumb when it comes to natural disasters, and basically stated that you really need to plan to not have any sort of help or assistance arriving for 72 hours after a storm or a natural disaster hits. So that's 3 days, without any sort of additional resources from the government, from different agencies. That's obviously going to put a lot more pressure on local resources and governments, nonprofit groups, and yourselves, right? Business leaders trying to help support employees. And I think these are all just really important things for us to take into consideration as we continue to look at the season. And before,
because we got a question about that. When you were mentioning, there's already a supply chain crisis, there is a war in Ukraine, there's already fuel shortages. Is there anything specific that organizations can do this year specifically that will, help them navigate some of those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, big thing is knowledge is power, right? There's a number of attendees on right here, right now. So obviously you're taking interest. So that to me indicates that a lot of people are already preparing. I think there's a reality to stocking up in advance of the season on things that are going to be necessary. If you have generators that you utilize or your employees utilize, obviously having enough fuel, safely supplied for you and your teams is going to be really important. I would say stock up, on the things that you and your company are going to need, and think ahead about some of the different categories and situations that we've already talked about. I wouldn't, expect people to go out and mass, purchase things like lumber, but we have seen a crunch on those things in the past. And I just think it's important for people to recognize that now and to, supply yourselves with a short stockpile so that you have those things in case the instances arise, not only for your businesses, but your employees. And I think it's important to let that information trickle down as well. As we mentioned earlier, it's not necessary that you have a location that is in an area that is hurricane prone, but you may have employees that are working and living in areas that are, and it's important for them to consider this as well.
Thank you.
Of course. And then before I jump into all the importance of identifying and monitoring storms and some of the communications best practices that we talked about earlier, Jason, I think it would be great for you to walk folks through some of the tips on how to prepare and protect people and property.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds good. And I think one of the key things to know about how to protect your life and property is to know what are some of those more pressing direct threats when it comes to these tropical storms and hurricanes. And so to kind of lead things off with more of the direct side of the equation, no real surprise here. This was a study conducted by what was at the time the active director of the National Hurricane Center, Edward Rappaport, and he's since retired, but he's done an extensive analysis on some of these direct causes of death. So this was a report released a few years ago, and really no surprise here. Storm surge is leading the way with nearly 50% of all direct causes of death directly attributable to the storm itself. But very close here is the threat of heavy rainfall and inland flooding, taking a quarter of all deaths related to tropical storms and hurricanes. And the main takeaway here is you might be a little surprised that winds are trailing far behind, less than 10% directly related to those extreme winds. And I really want to say that a lot of this is part due to the increase in forecast accuracy. People are boarding up, they're getting out of the way from the storm surge zone well ahead of these systems. So some of these numbers are starting to come down. And then to a lesser extent, we still have things like the tornadoes to worry about. Hazardous surf conditions can cause dangerous coastal waves well removed from the landfalling center. We're talking multiple states away where it might be sunny at the beach, and yet we're still seeing loss of life there. So definitely some things to consider. And before we go on to the next slide, one interesting point of information that's been coming out in some of the more recent hurricane conferences over the past month is that if we were to see an updated view of this chart, which only looked at the most recent 5 years, including storms like Hurricane Harvey in Texas, Hurricane Ida in Louisiana, we're seeing the amount of inland rainfall deaths skyrocketing compared to storm surge. In fact, it's now the inland rainfall flooding over the last 5 years that are now directly responsible for over 60 to 65% of all deaths. And some of that is even what we saw from the Northeast US last year, the hundreds of miles away from the landfall zone. So this is definitely something to consider going forward. Now, for some of the less common known things like indirect causes of death, you may be wondering, what is all this about? Cardiovascular incidents and such. Well, there's been new studies coming out over the last 5 to 8 years that are indicating it's really the elderly that are at high risk for things like this, because think about all the stress that comes about with hurricane watches, warnings, 12+ hour evacuation lines on the interstate. So we do see a significant uptick in medical related incidents. We also have people that fall victim when they're trying to evacuate. Think about people that need oxygen and they're taking out of their normal traditional space and placed in a vehicle for 12 hours. And so that's why we say whenever a hurricane watch is issued, if you have the means to leave early, definitely consider that. It doesn't take a mandatory evacuation to allow you to leave early, maybe beat some of that traffic. So formulate those plans well ahead of time, and actually now is the time to do some things like that. Also, when it comes to long-term power outages, a lot of the deaths that we saw last year in Louisiana came after the storm had come and gone. For example, power related to numerous reports of heat exhaustion. As you can imagine, Louisiana heat in the middle of summer, it's 100 degrees. It feels like 115 with the heat index due to the humidity. And you have people sitting in their homes for weeks on end with no way to cool down. saw too many incidents like that last year. And for now 2 years in a row, some of the bigger hurricanes like Laura and Ida, we saw several people fall victim to carbon monoxide poisoning that's due to improper generator use after the storm. And then other factors to consider, people are cleaning up the trees that had fallen in their backyard after the storm. They're using chainsaws for the first time. Bad things can certainly happen there. If you have some immediate roof work that needs to be done before a professional can get out there, we have people falling victim to things related to that. So many indirect causes of death, and this is gaining more traction within the weather community to let people know about these dangers that they may not be thinking about once the storm has left their area. So what are some things that we can start to factor well before the storm? And it really right now is the time to do it. Not before that red area shows up in the Gulf with a 90% chance of development, not before we could see rapid intensification over a weekend, and then we're dealing with widespread pandemonium along the Gulf Coast. So right now is the time to formulate the plan. In fact, you know, it might be a little late to get this message out, but by next year, even December, January, February, I know no one likes to talk about hurricanes during the winter, but that's really the time to start getting these things set into motion. So formulate that plan now. You're going to want to communicate all of these preparedness plans to your employees. That way, everyone is on the same page. You can conduct tabletop exercises with everyone that's going to be part of this preparedness plan. And you know, it really doesn't hurt for everyone to try to play devil's advocate a little bit, to try to poke holes in the plan. And you know, we might find some flaws within the build out of this. And so it's really important that we do these tabletop exercises in advance to see, you know, is this going to play out exactly how we're anticipating? And the one key thing about hurricanes is that no two storms are ever 100% alike. You know, there's different sizes, different intensity, lots of human-related things that even come into play in those final days. So, you know, the more we can prepare now, the better. And also encourage your own employees to devise their own personal plans with their family, because it's one thing for us as a business to have things laid out, but if your own employees start to fall victim to not being prepared on the family side, then they're going to be taken out of the equation with personal matters that are beyond your control. So encourage your own personnel to devise their own plans back at home. How to prepare your property. So another big thing besides just the life aspect of this, you know, first you want to maybe take a look at some of your county mitigation plans. In most cases, these can be actively found online with a quick Google search, and usually it's the local emergency management agency or the local city government. They will go ahead and put these documents online for everyone to view, and sometimes you can call attention to threats that maybe you haven't considered. Maybe they experience considerable flooding from a prior heavy rain or tropical storm event due to a river that's adjacent to the local area, things of that nature. So just the more information, the better. The more that you can read up on ahead of time, that would be one positive thing to do. And then more directly, when it comes to your individual property or business, of course, we always recommend inspect the roof ahead of time, especially with the last two hurricane seasons. We could be going into this season with at least some minor problems that you don't even know exist. And those are going to escalate into bigger problems once we get a couple more storms into the region and you get tropical storm conditions out there blowing tiles and shingles and things like that off of your roof. So get those inspected well ahead of time. Now is the time to do it. They can resolve any outstanding issues. That way you're more fortified before the real storm sets in. And also, I know Sarah's going to talk a little bit more about, you know, some of the supply chain issues, but I was actually just recently speaking with a few people in South Florida that were interested in replacing their typical windows with hurricane resistant windows. And with some of the supply issues that are still happening even into midsummer, some of this might not be available for 3 to 4 months. And by that point, we're outside of hurricane season. So the sooner you can start to tackle the list now, the better you're going to be. And of course, acquire those generators, backup power blocks. We don't want to be left without power if you have to still operate after the storm, even if the impacts were not quite as severe. The power outage issue is still going to be there. Could last several days, could last several weeks. Won't know that until the individual event really sets in, but that would definitely be a worthwhile consideration.
And Jason, I think I heard you speak on this maybe on a podcast, but didn't you say that taping windows is actually just a myth and it's a really bad idea? Is that correct?
Yeah, and this was something that was way more common to be talked about in the 90s and early 2000s. But even now, when you look at some of the media reports ahead of the storm, when they're under a hurricane warning, you see a lot of coastal businesses still taping up the windows, drawing the X with the duct tape and whatnot. But those windows are meant to shatter into small pieces so that they're not a threat when you're having 70, 80, 100+ mile an hour winds blowing through. And it really doesn't do anything to protect the property. If anything, it just makes the situation worse. You've got big shards of glass flying at people. So please just definitely don't do that.
Thank you.
And
right, so
yeah.
Back to you now.
All right, sounds good. Well, another way you can help to keep your people and your property and your businesses safe is by proactively monitoring for these things and really staying ahead of them. So one way you can do this is to invest in a threat intelligence solution that's going to help you see what's coming and understand the expectations of how things are going to impact you from your geographical, footprint of your organization and your people and all of your assets. And you can identify emergent threats faster and then respond in real time with automated impact assessments and warnings. There's also a lot of really helpful and useful public resources out there. I know hurricanes.gov is one that we go to a lot, and we really recommend that you do as well. It's something that if there's a storm coming towards you, you should really check regularly. They update their site very frequently with the latest in forecasting and where there's supposed to be prospective impacts. That way you can get your information straight from the source, and you can also be able to communicate that to your employees really quickly as well, which is going to be helpful.
Great.
And
hey,
then,
Sarah, we have a question about that real quick.
Sure.
Someone's asking for a consolidated list of contacts, websites, phone numbers, et cetera, for supports. And we do have that coming on a slide coming up. And if you do need to jump off, the person who asked that, you'll receive the recording. So we do have that coming up for you. All right.
Great.
Sorry.
Yeah, we've got a lot of great resources we can share with folks. So if anybody's interested, I know, Katie, you can provide some stuff afterwards, and Bob can help disseminate that too, which is great. And then speaking of communication, it's truly critical when it comes to hurricane preparedness and response to be a good communicator with your employee base and everybody that you're working with. Businesses should really be prepared with ready to send communications to protect people at every stage of a hurricane. The ability to develop kind of like a pre-built notification template in your emergency communication system is really going to help you save time, and time matters in these situations, right? If you're flustering around in a situation and it's already critical and you're trying to craft something, it's obviously going to be, overusing your time, and time is really precious in these circumstances. Before the storm, you should also proactively warn your people about what's approaching, right? Strong communication and transparency. You can also share evacuation information or preparedness advice, any of the resources that we're talking about today, and then expectations regarding when new information is going to come from the business, from leaders across the organization, and where it's going to come. And be really transparent with your employees. When are they going to receive updates? How are they going to receive updates? So that there's less confusion, right, for people that are already in situations that they're likely to feel vulnerable. So just really important to be able to do that, and to expect to hear from your employee base, giving them the opportunity to ask questions and have some sort of direct communication with the company and with the business leaders. During the storm, very important, check in on your people, right? There's ways to conduct surveys through communications platforms, wellness checks to see how they're doing, if they're staying safe, if they need anything, and if you can provide something as a business. And then after the storm, you can utilize communication in many different ways. Again, providing resources, helping provide aid to those who may need it on your staff the most. You can also survey people, figuring out whether they're able to work. If they're a remote employee, maybe they don't have power, maybe their internet's been cut, maybe they're feeling safe and want to get to a new location just to get their work done, really helping them to understand. And then also maybe they're just really stressed, they've gone through a traumatic situation, helping to understand those things as well. And then of course, if you have in-office employees, it's really important to be able to communicate what the status of the facilities are, right? Is everything grand and okay at the office? Everything's opening back up. We're happy that we, made it out on the other side with no damage. Or conversely, is the office down? Are streets around there dangerous? Is there no power? So just again, reinforcing, being transparent, and in these situations, really over communicating to the employees. And then also good to note that you should also have a plan to use alternate channels when you're talking about communication. Obviously, with power going down, a lot of things can be very disrupted during those times. So just, kind of wrapping it up, I think communication through each phase of the storm is truly key to being successful, not only on the business end, but on that employee safety end. So I think that about wraps it. So Katie, I'm going to go ahead and send it back to you. I know we had some really good questions during the session, but I think there were some more questions that were submitted ahead of time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to stick on that communication one for just a second, because someone wanted to know, like, where is the line between what communications the company sends out in terms of storms, and then what the government might be sending out in terms of alerts to citizens and things of that nature. Can you kind of clarify that a little bit?
Sure. And I think, the government alerts are obviously going to be very dependent on what your employee base is looking at and what they themselves have subscribed to. There may be a little bit of redundancy with information that you're sending, but in these situations, I think more is more. As we said in the survey that we had done of those 2,000 employees, people really do look to their employer as a trusted source of information. We know there's a lot of distrust in government agencies and in media. So I think people are really eager to hear from their business and their employer. And a lot of the things that they're going to be seeing and hearing, they're going to have questions about how it impacts them from a personal and professional level. So I think a good bit of redundancy is okay, even if you're sharing the same information you think your employees may be getting from the government or from the media locally. As long as it's a source of truth for you and your organization, I would feel highly comfortable sharing that information and continuously pushing updates to your employee base as well.
Gotcha. And I think this one we might want to stick with you too, Sarah, but of course, Jason, you feel free to weigh in anytime you have something to add. Well, actually, there's two questions that are similar, so let me read them both. What is the recommended time frame to put your response staff on alert that there is a storm, and then also to have them on site to respond to the storm? That's one. And the second question is, how many days out should businesses begin executing their hurricane plan? So basically, how far in advance should people start getting the balls rolling on their plan?
I think the easy indicator is as soon as you're hearing from somebody like Jason with, an expertise in the field or from the National Hurricane Center, and it looks like there may be an impact to your locations and your people, it is very fair early on to just give a blanket advanced warning to people. Hey, we're seeing this. They trust you, right? We're watching this. We'll keep people across the employee base posted on how this may impact our operations over the coming weeks. It may be something that just kind of dissipates and doesn't have an impact, but I think it's very fair to give very early warning, and I think employees will trust and respect that as well. And then I think part of the question was about, being on site. I know that that's probably highly specific towards maybe an industry or a business focus. I think when it comes to being on site, if you need people on site during the midst of an actual event like a hurricane, you're going to want to get people there well in advance. I would say, several hours in advance of things really getting strong and coming on shore. Jason, I think you probably got a little bit more on timing and stuff, but you obviously want people to move around as safely as possible and have a safe venue for them to hunker down during the storm. So I would say that's just really important at watching the forecasting and probably over adjusting too. If you feel like noon time is the best time, I'd probably move it up a few hours just for safety reasons.
Excellent.
Yeah, 100%. Just a quick additional things to consider, and this goes back to the one point I made about Ida, is just because you see a new advisory pop up for a brand new named storm, don't assume that you have a 5 to 10 day window to make preparations for this thing. Sometimes we're seeing these storms develop right off the Florida coast. You don't have more than 2 to 3 days to prepare. And with the threat of rapid intensification, don't dismiss the warnings that are going out. Read into those advisories a little bit. I know that sometimes we don't have the time to do all the necessary reading, but sometimes there's some key details that are missing in there that are definitely worthwhile. And when it comes to staffing and whatnot, I would say that everyone's timeline is a little bit different just because different companies have different logistical challenges. But certainly once those hurricane warnings are in effect, you're basically rushing last minute preparations at that point, and it's time to hunker down.
Got it. Thank you both. And then let me just start with you on this one, Sarah. And once again, Jason, please chime in. What are you seeing as best practice for loss of personnel relating to storm impact? Have you seen companies doing things like standing up remote command centers, sending critical resources to areas outside of impact, things like that? This person has a large, diverse workforce now and is just wondering what some industry standards are on that front.
Yeah, sure. You definitely do see a lot of companies, dependent upon location, standing up remote areas. Obviously, it's going to be highly dependent on your workforce and whether you want to move people around. But if you have the capability, I think it's a really smart thing to do. It also is helpful having people in one location to be able to mitigate risk and to respond. And then I think just from the employee impact, and I think we mentioned this earlier, really being able to survey your employee base in a trusted communication way, I think is really important in these situations so that you can hear from the employee base wherever they're located as to what the impacts might be and to open up that line of communication so they can ask for help.
Let me weigh in there too, because there was a great podcast episode from Coca-Cola Bottling, and they talked about how their command center was actually impacted by the storm. The roof caved in. So they had to sort of scramble to communicate that out to employees like, hey, don't come to the command center. You know, people that are supposed to work here don't come because we can't, you know, safely have you in the building. And they had to relocate it out to the parking lot and scramble to put up, you know, tenting and things like that. So I think that's also where that great communication comes in, is just keeping people informed, sometimes even on a minute-to-minute basis about what's going on.
Yeah, and that redundancy of location is helpful too.
Absolutely. Well, we have time for one more question. So Jason, I'm going to put this one to you. This person experienced Hurricane Harvey in Houston a few years back. They were told to evacuate due to rising floodwaters from the hurricane, but then were told minutes later to shelter in place because the hurricane was causing tornadoes. So how do you recommend that folks prioritize, I guess, multiple hurricane hazards at once?
Yeah, no, that's a really difficult situation, and I'm not sure if there even is quite a prime answer for something like that, but this kind of goes back to the preparation phase where you need to try to account for whether or not you live in a flood vulnerable community before the storm even gets there. And it can be storm surge, but it can also be inland rainfall flooding, whether it be near a river, tributary, anything like that. And if you know that that area has a particular history of flooding, it might be best to evacuate out of that area. It doesn't even need to necessarily be completely out of that city per se, but just a different part of the suburbs to get out of that more extreme location. And when it comes time to the tornado threat, that's a much more imminent thing. It's happening within, 10, 15 minutes. So by all means necessary, try to hunker down, stay away from a second floor window, stay away from the second floor altogether, lowest floor into an interior room or closet, something to that effect.
Well, thank you both. Before we get to those recommended resources, because I do want to have time for that, I just want to launch that last additional poll here, because, you guys have heard all of these great details, all this great information from Alert Media's senior meteorologist, the VP of Global Intelligence, but we also have many, many more safety, security, and weather and business continuity experts on our team. So with that in mind, just take a quick second to let us know if you are interested in learning more about how Alert Media can help with your hurricane preparedness and communications. And if you tell us yes, we will happily follow up with you and get you all the information that you need. And of course, you can also say not at this time and no hard feelings at all. So Bob, I'm going to give that just another couple seconds, and then you can go ahead and close that out. Perfect. And as promised, here are the resources that Jason and Sarah recommend to help you stay up to date with any hurricane developments. And again, as Sarah said earlier, it's important to check these sources as often as possible during hurricane season. And again, we are sending out a recording of this webinar, so don't feel like you have to rush to write these down right now. We will get them to you so you have easy access to them. And with that, I just want to thank Sarah Prattley and Jason Moreland for joining us today. Jason, I'll start with you. We just really appreciate your expertise and insight. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, no problem at all. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me, whether it's via email or if LinkedIn is easier. But you do see my email address below, so reach out anytime.
Wonderful. And Sarah, thank you as well. You have a lot of great expertise in this area, and we really appreciate you sharing it with us.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. My pleasure.
Wonderful. Well, that concludes our presentation today. I hope everyone feels at least a little bit more prepared for yet another above average hurricane season. So we're all in it together, and it's coming quickly. So thank you so much for spending an hour with us today. I hope to see you again on a future Alert Media webinar. It would be our pleasure. And of course, I want to thank Bob and everyone at DRJ for hosting us today and being such a great partner. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Bob, to wrap up.
Wonderful. Thanks. Great discussion here today. Thanks again, everyone, for your attendance here today. We hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. I'd like to personally thank Katie, Sarah, and Jason for their time here today, as well as Alert Media for sponsoring today's webinar. We will again be emailing everyone a link to the recording. You may view that recording as often as you wish or share it with your peers. If you have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar. Thanks, everyone.